Well, it's good to see those of us that are here this morning. We're kind of light. But anyway, good to see everyone. We're in Romans and moving through, getting to the end of 10. And, you know, Paul's great. Paul really here trying to show them that the Jews aren't really the ones going to heaven necessarily now. You know, that's changed. And that God decides who he gives grace to, right? And if God decides to give grace to the Gentiles or decided to do that, then they need to be on that same idea. So it's at the end of chapter 10, he makes some quotes from Isaiah. He says, Isaiah said, I was found by those who did not seek me. I became manifest to those who did not ask for me. Paul using this to let them know that, you know, that he was moving to a different people, right? That it wasn't just the Jews. And here talking about the Gentiles, the Greeks, he's saying, you know, I was found by those who did not seek me, right? But for Israel, he says, all the day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. So, you know, he's saying Israel's been disobedient, they've been obstinate, they've stood against God instead of with God, even though they should have been God's people. And because of that, of course, God has turned to the Gentiles, has given another path for all mankind, not just for Israel. So that's kind of where we get to at the end of chapter 10. He's kind of wrapping that up. A lot of things went on in 9, a lot of things go on in 10. But as we move to 11, he starts to kind of tie this together a little bit because 12 is kind of going to shift in the book. So when we get into chapter 11, we're kind of finishing up this kind of section here a little bit. 12 is going to shift a little. So we're kind of wrapping up this Gentile-Jewish dilemma that Paul's been speaking about, trying to argue to the Jews that God's grace has moved to the Gentiles, that it's now because of grace, not because of works. It's because of who God chooses. And God had the opportunities. He goes through. He said, you know, God chose different ways. Remember, we looked at that, right? God chose Isaac, the child of promise, over Ishmael. God chose Jacob over Esau. You know, God chooses who he wills. But then he gets to 11, he says, God has not rejected Israel, which is saying his people, right? It's a rhetorical question, right? He didn't reject them. He gave them a path along with us, as we looked at if you look at Hebrews, right? Hebrews 10, where it says, apart from us, they would not be, or Hebrews 11, at the end of 11, where it says, apart from us, they would not be made perfect. In other words, he gave them a way with us to get to heaven, but not separate from us. And that's, I think, what people still don't have a hard time wrapping their head around. They're like, well, Israel is going, and we're all like on parallel paths to heaven. That's just not true. There's only one path. Jesus was really plain about that, right? He says, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus was very specific about it. There's no other way. There's not two parallel paths to get to heaven. And a lot of people think that, right, today. And a lot of people think, well, there's a lot of ways to get to heaven, right? There's a lot of different paths to get to heaven. That's not what Jesus said. You know, Paul says, I'm an Israelite, right? Descendant of Abraham. I'm an Israelite. You know, I would be left out too if God had rejected. But, you know, God didn't reject. God does not reject his people, right? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have torn down your altars. I alone am left. They're seeking my life, talking about Elijah. You know, when Elijah had his great victory and he fled from Jezebel and he wound up at the mountain of God, and God spoke to him. He says, why you sit down? And Elijah says, you know, I alone am left. Just take my life. And God said, and God told Elijah, right? He said, I've kept myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So, you know, God's saying, even in the midst of all this that's going on with Israel, there's a remnant, right? There's those of Israel who believed in Christ. There's those in Israel who came to Christ. There's a way for them to get to God. In the same way, there's a present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. But would you think about that? What's a remnant mean? What's that? It's a little piece, right? A remnant. I mean, if you make a dress, you say, well, I got a remnant left. It's nothing compared to the dress, right? And, that's Paul saying. He says there's a remnant of Israel. It's not nothing compared to what Israel was. It's just a piece. There's a piece. There's a piece of it left that is going to get to heaven. A piece of them that are going to believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior. A piece of them that's still going to be obedient to God. What did he just say? He said there were disobedient people, right? God rejected them because they were disobedient. Well, huh? Right. Yeah, just like Isaiah said, right? So they're disobedient people, and God requires obedience, doesn't he? He always has. He always will. He says if it's by grace, it's no longer the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. What do you make of that? We struggle with that, don't we? Grace, not works, right? But grace is something you have to be in grace. It doesn't just fall on you, right? You have to be in it. You have to choose it. You have to choose grace. And, it doesn't just fall on the whole world. It's something you have to decide. You have to be obedient to Christ in order to be in that state of grace. But it's not because of works, and we understand that. What is Israel? What then? What Israel is seeking, it is not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. And that goes right back to 9, and we struggled with that, didn't we? Is it the individual? No, it's not. It's not the individual at all. He's not saying, oh, God chose this Israelite to be saved and this Israelite to be hardened. That's not what Paul's saying here. He's saying that it was to all, right? They chose. But most of them are hardened, right? Some of them were obtained it, but most of them were hard. Most of them didn't. Because God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to not see, ears to not hear, down to this very day. God gave them a spirit of stupor. Yeah, I think when you look at this a little bit, think about Saul. When did God give Saul the troubling spirit? When did God do that? After he disobeyed him, right? Till Saul disobeyed him, God was with Saul, right? God wanted Saul to flourish. God wanted Saul to succeed. But when Saul failed, when Saul was disobedient to God, God gave him a troubling spirit. When do you think God gave Israel a spirit of stupor? Right, after they failed, right? Isn't it fascinating, though, when you look at Old Testament text? Of course, y'all that know me well enough know I kind of get hung up on this stuff, but isn't it fascinating when you look at what Isaiah said? Who gave him the spirit of stupor? Boy, in a New Testament sense, we don't think about God that way, do we? We don't think about God, anything bad, anything negative at all coming from God, do we? I mean, in the New Testament, do we? We don't think of that as New Testament Christians. We kind of lean on James, right? All good things come right from God, right? All good things. And I'm all right with that. All good things come from God. We don't think of anything bad, anything evil. In the New Testament, we think all bad and all evil comes from who? Comes from Satan, right? But in the Old Testament, where was he? You can hunt and hunt for him. He's just hard to find. The Old Testament people never said, oh, well, Satan did that. Satan sent a troubling spirit to Saul. God did it. Satan's who made Israel fall, right? Satan sent them a spirit of stupor. But no, in the Old Testament it says what? It says God sent them a spirit of stupor, doesn't it? Job says, when everything fails, Job says what? The Lord giveth And the Lord taketh away, right? Never says anything about Satan. Yeah. I'd probably have to look, Ray. You're probably hitting me with something. I can't answer that right now. But I'll look. Yeah, it's been a while since I really looked at Isaiah. You know, when you start reading major prophets, you can get bogged down. You really can't. You can kind of wander around in there for a while, get lost. but, but, but you know, that stuff in the Old Testament, they attribute that to God, and they attribute our failure to us, right? To mankind. And that's kind of just a difference, and it's a big difference to me. And you know, those of you that know me always kind of struggle with that shift, with that. I call it a quantum shift, right? It's a huge shift in theology between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You know, David says, let their tail become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and retribution. Their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs forever. They did not stumble so as to fall, right? But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. So they're saying the Jews should be jealous of us, right? The Jews should be jealous of us, what we got. That because of what we obtained, they should want it. They should want what we have. We shouldn't want what they have. They should want what we have, right? They should want us. If their transgression is riches for the world, their future is riches for the Gentile, how much more will their fulfillment be? You know, the idea here is that they can come just like we can come. They can do just like we did. The idea here is that the Gentiles, who the Jews despised, now have access to heaven. That's hard for them to wrap their head around. They don't like the Gentiles. You know, if you don't like somebody, if you really don't like somebody, you really don't want good things to happen to them. That's just human nature, right? And here, the Gentiles, who they despise, are all of a sudden the ones that's saying, oh, they got heaven. They're going to get heaven. Now you got to be like them instead of them being like you. But the Jews were like, no, they need to be like us, right? And Paul's saying, no, you need to look at them. You need to be jealous of them, jealous of what they have, not the other way around. It's really a big shift in what we think, right? Paul is pleading with his own people in Romans. He's pleading with his own people. He's a Jew. His family's Jewish. People he loves are Jewish. He's pleading with his own people, isn't he? He says, I'm speaking to you, Gentiles, insomuch as I'm an apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry. And somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. You know, it's interesting because if you go back a little bit, you can kind of take this kind of a different way, can't you? If you back up to the end here, if you back up to 19, no, wrong way, sorry. If you back up here to 12, the riches, the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? You can almost say, well, they're still going to go. They're still going to make it, right? Even though they're Jews, you can almost look at it. But when you go to here, it says what? It says that somehow I might save some of them. A remnant, right? If I might save some of them. For if their rejection is a reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump also, and the root is holy, the branches are too. You know, compare Christ to that a lot, don't we? Compare him to that idea of root and branches, and that we all have this common root, this common start in faith, and that because of that, we all grow into this spiritual house. That's kind of the idea, biblical idea of that. And you know, the truth is that, you know, if you go all the way back to Abraham, Islam and Judaism and Christianity all have that root, don't they? They all go to Abraham. All of them do. But then that tree splits, doesn't it? Splits a lot of different ways. Splits to Islam, splits to Judaism, splits to Christianity, splits to all the different branches of all these different religions which exist. So we all have that root, but what happened, right? How come are we not all on the same path? Why are we all on different paths? Promise came through one, right? One branch. What was you going to say, Teddy? Yeah, even if it's funny, isn't it? Because even if you go to Christianity, right? I mean, there's major splits in Christianity, even way back, right, centuries ago. And then even now, as you move to where we're at now, how many different denominations are there? How many different theologies, even in Christianity, right? And even in the Church of Christ, how many divisions, right? The truth is, we ain't ever seem to agree, can we? For some reason, we can't ever seem to. Why is that, do you think? Why do you think we miss? I think I've always kind of had my answer to this, but why do you think that we can't stay, why do you think we divide so much over small things? Yeah, it could be Satan. I agree. Right, he's got to miss by a little. A lot of people think they're right. We think we're right. I don't know. I'm always seeking truth myself. I never think I know it all. I know I don't. I, uh, I think a lot of it is we don't focus enough on the goal. We get so concerned about the journey, we forget what we're all trying to do. We're all trying to get to heaven, right? That's the goal. The goal is to get to heaven. That's the goal, right? And if we focus on that enough and worry about the important things concerning that and forget about a lot of this, like you said, stuff that really doesn't matter, trivial stuff that really probably is not important, we could stay on that same, we could all kind of get together. But in some ways, I always kind of find a kind of a warped way, but people get so upset about faith because it's important to them. We forget that sometimes, We think, oh, people just argue to argue, or people just get upset to get upset. But the reason we get upset about theology or doctrine or faith or whatever word you want to put in there is because it's that important to us, And because of that, we tend to buck up, We want to argue our point, defend our position, right? And so I think there's a lot of things here. Why do the Jews not accept Jesus? Because it was important to them. Their faith was important to them. Their idea of how to get where they were going was important. It was all about that to them. They couldn't back away from it and look at the bigger picture, look at the bigger goal. Yeah, well, there was a lot of different worship, right? And, but throughout the centuries, we still struggle with the same things, it seems like. But in our hearts, we should desire to get to heaven, Well, sure it is. Faith without works is dead, but grace is what saves us, right? This difficult conundrum. Huh? It is a narrow gate. It's true. Only a remnant will be saved. Only a few are going to go to heaven. It's narrow, no doubt about it. The gate is narrow that leads to salvation. Few there be, the scriptures say, who find it, which means you almost have to look for it in order to find it. You're not just going to happen down that path. You got to look for it, right? It's like trying to find that little road when you're trying to find something out in the country, You got to find that little road, And that's kind of how it is with salvation. We have to find that path. And so I think there's a lot that goes on here. When I read Romans, I know it's this Jewish Gentile conundrum, But I always kind of see a part of everybody in this throughout the centuries. You know, our division, our inability to maybe love enough to do things that we need to do, you know. Like you said, human nature. I agree with you. I agree with you. To a large extent, that's human nature. We all tend to be a little stubborn, a little obstinate at times, don't we? We sometimes argue things that maybe we even know not to be true, but we believed it so long, we're still going to stick with it. You know, we just need to be loving people, I guess. Yeah.
Take the example of the ones that believe in miracles still today, and they were, a lot of them were raised in churches that, and their parents, or that believe that. And if the Bible would have been, there will be no more miracles, no more, if it was just real plain, but it's not. You have to seek it. You have to, you know, it's you read to find out that see where it stopped and why it stopped, and there is a part that tells you, but it's not real plain. So you have to really seek that. And if you're raised in a church with all your family and your friends, and they all believe that, even being shown that their mind is not wanting to go there. And it is hard. It's hard. And so many people are raised in different churches that believe things that they don't want to believe. You know, like I have said before, I studied with a girl that was raised in a Pentecostal church, and we studied for a long time. And at the last, she said, "You know, Sherry, you can't change my home church." Saying, even if I see this, I can't leave my church. And, you know, my only answer could be, well, I can, but only God can. And, you know, it's hard for I could see how she just couldn't change. And
Yeah, well, I've kind of come to a point that, you know, I really want to focus. You know, I used to be that guy that was ready to argue doctrine with anybody, you know, any little point of doctrine. I was always in the fight, you know. But, you know, I've kind of come to this point in my life where that's not the fight in this dog anymore, you know. The fight in me is to get people to heaven. You know, that's the only fight I got. I got no other war. You know, I've come to that conclusion, you know. I just don't have another battle in me. You know, I mean, I'm all right with agreeing to disagree about a ton of things if I can get somebody to heaven, you know. I mean, I'm all right with that. I just want to get them obedient to Christ. I want to teach them the truth of God's love. I want to, you know, I don't bash people. I don't criticize people. I just try to show them the truth to the best I know the truth is. I want to be open-minded. I want to be a person that can interact with somebody else that believes differently than me, that can influence them in a way. Because, you know, I've come to a conclusion in my life that, you know, you can't, when you go into a discussion in anything in life, but especially in theology, I guess, you know, if you wanted to argue politics, but I never even want to get in that fight. But if you get into a discussion with someone in a theological setting, a theological sense, you know, you're never going to gain anybody by both of you standing on one side and yelling at each other. You're just never going to do it. You know, that's just not how you win. That's not how you influence people. You influence people by loving them, by showing them the truth, by looking at it together, by being open-minded to what they believe, looking at what they believe, and being open-minded to it, saying, why do you believe this? Why, this is what I believe. This is why I believe what I believe. Why do you believe what you believe? It's not, and I think when you stand with somebody in an argument and and you say, well, this is what I believe, and I'm going to show you what I believe, and you know, I don't think that's a win. You know, I think the win is to say, you know, you show me what you believe first. You know, you show me what and why you believe that, and why that's important to you, and why you think this is important. You know, and then let me show you what I believe, and let's look at what I believe, and let's look at it together. You know, because the truth is that you know, so many times those discussions just turn into a screaming match. You know, don't they? I mean, they just turn into a shouting match, and you're never going to win. You're never going to win that. I mean, you can yell as loud as you want, but if somebody's not going to listen to you, you know, yelling isn't going to solve the problem, right? You know, so Paul, in this case, look at his writing. Look at how he wrote to them. He wasn't yelling at them. He wasn't screaming at them, was he? He was crying for them. You know, if you read Romans, he was crying for them, wasn't he? That, oh, that I could save some of you. Oh, I wish I could even be lost. Remember that when he said that? I wish that it was even me for the sake of you, you know. Paul's not screaming here. Paul's not in their face. Paul's crying. Paul's pleading. Paul's begging. Look at this. Look at what I'm showing you. Look at what the Old Testament says. I desire you to be saved. Paul's mind was on the goal, wasn't it? Wasn't his mind on the goal? All through Paul's writing, wasn't that what he was? You know, what did he tell him? He says, if you want to keep those days, keep them. I want you to go to heaven, right? If you think you don't need to eat food sacrificed to idols, then don't eat it. If you think you need to eat food sacrificed to idols, then eat it. I don't care. I want you to go to heaven. You know? Paul wasn't screaming at people. Paul was pleading with people. You know, how important do we want people to be saved? Right? This isn't a battle. This isn't a victory to be won. This is a... No, but he was giving them a lot of ways to make it work.
If they, in today's world, if you can do whatever you want to do as long as it's not against the Bible.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can't say, well, it's okay to believe this if it's not.
Well, I think...
You know, you're absolutely right. You cannot argue. You know, at the end of our discussion, it was, let's just agree to disagree.
Right. Right.
And that doesn't help anything.
I think you got to apply that, live such a good life among the Gentiles as they can. I know that's for the Jews, it applies to the same thing between all the different denominations. One of the guys I work with, one of the best friends I've got, is Assembly of God. Great guy, well studied. I mean, we talk a lot, and we've never had an argument. But that he can listen to my point, I can listen to his.
Yeah. But Paul's not saying that, you know, they can be a Jew and go to heaven. Absolutely not. He's not saying they can be wrong and be saved. Absolutely not. And we should never say that either. But my point is that, you know, when you're studying with somebody, you're pleading for their soul. You know, and so many times in my life, that wasn't my concern in the discussion. My concern wasn't really their soul. My concern was that I wanted to be right. You know? And I think when you do that, you miss. And I think that's something in my faith, in my Christianity, you know, that's definitely something that's changed in me. But when I was a kid, young kid, you know, I loved that scripture, every knee will bow and every mouth shall confess. And I thought, boy, we're going to show them, you know, we're going to show them. On that day, I'm going to show them who's right. I'm going to show them I was right. And now, you know, I just think, what a terrible day. The people will be lost, and I won't have a chance to save them. You know, as a Christian, our goal should be to get people to heaven. Our goal should be to save souls. Our goal should be obtaining that ourselves, right? And taking as many people with us as we can.
When you earnestly study with somebody that's got a different viewpoint, you might learn something you don't know too.
Yeah.
And if you, and even if you still feel like you're 100% right, and they're what we call in disagreement with what we believe, if you can just teach and love them instead of hurting them or scarring them, maybe eventually they'll look at it different. Or, I mean, you don't have to do it. So we try to turn them around right now. I want you to see this right now before we leave. Maybe just, if you just grasp one verse with me. Because you go, miracles don't exist anymore. That's gone away with. Well, no, it's not. It is in the apostolic gift sense. But if there wasn't miracles, I wouldn't pray. We believe that miracles come through prayer from God now, not through the hands of a man with a gift. But we still believe in miracles, don't we?
Yeah.
So maybe that's a better way to say it instead of, there are no more miracles. You know, I mean, tell them what we believe instead of just trying to say that's wrong. Because I've been down there. I've been the argumentative guy a lot. And I'm trying to change that too, because there's a better way. I mean, Christ never hated anybody into submission. He loved them, right?
Right.
But he will turn away from you at some point.
I think Paul, that's kind of a lesson from Paul too, you know. Paul eventually said what? He says, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. I mean, eventually Paul said, you know, I've tried with you, I've taught you, I've give you that idea, but he says, you know, there's only so much Paul, there's only so much me. And the truth is, you know, sometimes we worry so much about trying to teach people in other denominations or try to get denominations to come together, when truth is there's a whole lot more people this morning sitting home than there is sitting in a church. You know, sometimes we're missing the boat, you know, and that's kind of what Paul said, you know. He says, I'll go to the Gentiles. You know, sometimes we worry so much about trying to change people who believe instead of trying to make people believe. You know, and I think sometimes we waste our energy, you know, why can't we worry about, you know, I agree. It's going to be hard to change what a lot of people believe. You're not going to do it. But the truth is there's a lot of people out there that don't believe, you know, and I mean, why is our energy, when all our energy is focused on fighting each other and debating amongst each other, isn't Satan winning in that? I mean, really? Isn't Satan really the winner? Because we're not spending time on people who aren't even in church, who don't even believe in God or don't even know the way, right? You know, it's a lot easier to hoe fresh ground. I mean, I'm just telling you, it's a lot easier to hoe fresh ground sometimes. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, Paul teaches us that, doesn't he? Paul works and works on this, but eventually what does Paul say? He says, I'm going to the Gentiles. I'm going to people that have never heard the gospel, right? Because I know I can convert them. I can change them. A lot of lessons in this for us, you know. He says, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear, Paul says, right? You see what he says? Don't be conceited. Be fearful, right? Be fearful. He says, if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either, right? In other words, there's no reason, we can't be conceited. You can never set back. Our salvation is something we work out with fear and trembling our entire life, you know. We're all trying to get to the same place. We're all trying to accomplish the same goal. The kindness and severity of God to those who fell. Severity, but to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will be cut off. You know, nobody's safe, right? You can be cut off too. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So in other words, they still have an opportunity to come back, to come to God, to do what God wants them to do. He says, if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and were grafted contrary to nature to a cultivated olive tree, how much more those are natural branches be grafted into their own? For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so you will not be wise in your own estimation, but a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. You know, Paul's still looking for the Israel to come back, for Israel to come back to God. And so all Israel will be saved. That's something we have to talk about. The deliverer will come from Zion, will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. All Israel will be saved. But you know, Paul's not talking about physical Israel, right? In the Old Testament, that prophecy is not about physical Israel. It's about spiritual Israel. Spiritually, Israel will all be saved. God did bring Israel back. God did do to Israel what God said God was going to do to Israel. We are spiritual Israel. The church is today. And we will all be saved if you're in that body. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. They're loved, right? Beloved. Beloved's a really endearing term. Paul wants them back. Paul loves them. Paul wants them back. Paul wants to win them back. But he knows that only a remnant will be saved. But Paul still wants them all to be saved, doesn't he? He's pleading in Romans, pleading with them, crying over them, trying to pull them back to Christ, pull them back. And I think you really have to see that in this book. It says they've been shown mercy because of their disobedience. You know, Paul said, I obtained grace and mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief, Paul said, right? And Paul says they can obtain that same mercy that I obtained, that same love that I obtained. It says they've also been disobedient because of the mercy shown to you, they'll be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience so that he may show mercy to all. You know, they're all lost without us, right? Isn't that what he says? Romans 3:23, all have sinned. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. All these people are going to be lost. All these Jews, even the Gentiles that don't come to faith, are going to be lost yet. Paul understands that that's been poured out on everybody. The depths of the rich of the knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? And who became his counselor? Who is first given to them that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. You know, Paul's pleaded with them. He's told them God can have mercy on whom he has mercy. Paul has told them there's a way, showed them a way, tried to make them see they need to be like the Gentiles, tried to make them all pull in. And at this point in Romans, now Paul's kind of shutting the chapter on that. It's a lot of book. It's a lot of reading, and we've been through a lot. But when we start into 12, we kind of shift gears. Because as much as Paul was wanting to is showing these Jews how they need to be like the Gentiles, they need to come to Christ, they need to do that. Now in 12, Paul really gives us this real amazing insight into this idea of sacrifice, right? The Jews were all about sacrifice. They sacrificed to God. They laid it on the altar. They did all these things. And now he says you're still a sacrifice. You're still giving a sacrifice, you see. It's a really powerful passage, Romans 12. Especially the first part of it. I urge you, brethren, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. In Romans 12:1, the word worship here, the word that most translators throw in here at the end of this, is not really the word for worship in the New Testament. The word for worship in the New Testament is proskuneo, which means to fall on your face, fall down before God and worship God, to show obeisance to God. The word here in Romans 12:1 is the word latiro, which actually means service. And in the Hebrew, or the Septuagint of the Hebrew, it actually meant service in the temple. So the idea here, that the latiro was the idea of the priests going in every day and doing the service in the temple that they did. That's the picture of Romans 12:1 and 2. Now, translators try to put this where we understand it. So they say service of worship. Depends on the translation you read. Young's Literal has a different, it goes different here, or spiritual service. We're out of time. I want to spend some time here. So we're going to spend time here next Sunday morning. And I'll try to break that down a little bit for you. I think it's a really interesting passage. And it really starts to maybe let us think a little bit about worship and service and the difference in that. And we need to spend some time there. So we'll spend some time here next Sunday morning. Thanks for your attention this morning.